What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Stamina Templar DPS. Still a very well desired DPS spec in Dragon Bones, mainly due to their minor fracture and minor breach. Stamina Templars are the only consistent source of that debuff through their Power of the Light ability, so that's why you will commonly see at least one Stamina Templar in a lot of raid groups, because even though the debuff is only small, around 1320, that translates to about a 2% increase in the damage done, which does, when you spread it across 8 or 9 DPS, it does add up to a pretty sizable margin. So Stamina Templars, while they might not pull as much DPS as a Stam BK or a Stamina Nightblade, still have a very, very welcome spot in a lot of the Trials teams. Now, just like the rest of our build videos, we'll be going over gear, our skill bars, our CP point distributions, and we'll talk about things like race, attribute points, Mundus stone. And then we'll talk about our rotation a little bit, kind of what goes on in the rotation, what you should prioritize, things like that. And then we'll top things off with a 6 million dummy parse so you guys can get an idea of the kind of DPS you can expect to pull with a Stamina Templar. So, first things first, let's go ahead and get started with the gear. For our monster helm, we're going with 2-piece Velidreth. Velidreth is still the strongest monster helm for Stamina DPS. You do have a couple of options though. You can go with Selene's, Kra'gh, or even Stormfist if you would like, but Velidreth is the strongest choice out there, just in terms of DPS as well as versatility. I do have a heavy shoulder. That's just to give myself a little bit more survivability by giving me a little bit more health. You can go with 7 medium if you would like. I go with 6 medium, 1 heavy, because I do prefer to stay alive with the additional health. But it kind of depends on how you feel and how comfortable you are with the class. You can go with 7 medium if you feel like you don't need that additional survivability. For our first piece here, we are going with Sunderflame. Sunderflame is a medium set that's dropped from City of Ash. We are going with the heavy attack build here. Stamplars just generally don't have that same level of sustain that Stam DKs do, so they can't necessarily do a light attack rotation. So we're sticking with heavy attack, so Sunderflame is a good choice here. Now there are a couple of other buff and debuff sets that you could be asked to use in a raid scenario. Night Mother's Gaze is one debuff set that you might be asked to wear, as well as Morag Tong. Morag Tong, however, is only really powerful when you have 2 or more stamina DKs in your group. If you have only 1 DK in your group, then Morag Tong isn't quite as strong as it could be. So Sunderflame and Night Mother's Gaze are 2 sets that you definitely want to have as a Stamina Templar, or any Stamina DPS, but Morag Tong kind of depends on your group. If you have 2 Stam DKs in your group that run very regularly, then it might be worth picking up a Morag Tong set. Another buff set that you might consider using is also War Machine. Stamina Templars, you have an option of a cheap ultimate that only costs 72 ultimate through Crescent Sweeps, so that plays very well with War Machine. However, you don't necessarily be using War Machine combined with something like Sunderflame. Or rather, you won't be combining that with Vicious Ophidian. So that's another buff set you can consider wearing, but generally speaking, War Machine will not be replacing the buff set, it will be replacing Vicious Ophidian instead because of the Minor Slayer that's shared across both sets. For our second set, we are going with War Machine here. If you are using War Machine and you are using Crescent Sweep as your primary ultimate like we have here, then you will want 3 jewelry and 2 armor pieces because you want War Machine active on all times. Crescent Sweeps is going to be on our back bar, so that's why we want the 5-piece active at all times with War Machine. So our weapons here are going to be from our debuff set, so Sunderflame. For our jewelry, we're going with all weapon damage enchants. Again, we are going with a heavy attack build, so sustain is not quite an issue. So we can go with weapon damage enchants here and don't need to necessarily worry about adding on a regen glyph. Now for our weapons, I have an axe and a dagger. However, you can go with double daggers if you would like. Stamplars do get additional crit damage, so you will see a better return from using double daggers compared to, for example, a stamina Dragon Knight. What's important is to maintain the traits and the enchants across both weapons here. So for your main hand, you're going to go with Nirn with a poison damage enchant, and for your offhand, you're going with infused with a weapon damage enchant. And then for our back bar, we have a Nirn Maelstrom Bow with a Double Ravage Health poison. Now, if you do not want to use War Machine, you can replace this with Lich's Ophidian instead. Again, just like with War Machine, you want the 3 jewelry and 2 armor pieces, just because you do want to maintain that 8% reduction in stamina cost. That's just a very, very welcome added sustained bonus. You kind of want to keep that active while you're on your bow bar. If you do are one of those stamina DPS that gets to play around with 2 damage sets, then you can actually replace any of these sets here with either Hunding's Rage or Briarheart. Briarheart will pull a little bit higher than Hunding's if you're using weapons, but Hunding's you can only get it crafted, so you can't get any jewelry with Hunding's Rage. So if you are going to be going with Hunding's, you do keep that in mind, that you will have to have jewelry in that second 5-piece set that you are going to be using, and that could limit you if you want to use something like War Machine. So do keep that in mind if you want to use Hunding's Rage. For our race, we are a Redguard. Redguards are generally regarded as the best stamina DPS race. But you do have other options here. Redguards are just notable because they get the most stamina. They get 10% stamina compared to 6% from Khajiits and Bosmer. They do get lower regen at 9%, but their real power comes from the Adrenaline Rush passive, which basically restores stamina every time you do a melee attack every 5 seconds. That's really helpful for your sustain, and that's what makes Redguard a very powerful stamina DPS class, race. The other options are Khajiit. They had 6% max stamina, and I believe it's 12 or 9% stamina regen. Plus they get 8% additional crit chance. So Khajiits are a very good choice for Templars as well, because Templars do have that additional crit damage. But you do lose out on sustain as a result, so it is a little bit harder to sustain on a Khajiit. But Khajiits are a very strong choice for race as well. Your third choice, in the base game at least, is Bosmer. Bosmers have 21% stamina regen and 6% additional stamina, so they do have slightly better sustain just in terms of stamina regen, but ultimately Redguards do win out because of that Adrenaline Rush passive. Now, if you have access to the Imperial Edition, you can go with the Imperials. As a race, they get 12% max health and 10% max stamina, so you don't have to necessarily worry about using a heavy armor piece or putting points into health in order to meet get your survivability, because Imperials do have that additional 12% additional health. But that is locked behind the Imperial upgrades, so don't feel like you need to purchase it in order to become an Imperial. Imperials, while they are good stamina DPS, they generally fall short of Khajiits and Redguards, mainly because of the lack of sustain that they get. For our attribute points, we have 64 points into stamina, but you can move a couple of points into health if you feel like you need that additional survivability. It's kind of up to you how you want to play with it. Depends on how comfortable you are with the class, as well as the content that you are running with this tune. We don't actually have a Mundus stone, so I'll go pick that up real quick. We are using blue food, so max health and max stamina food. That's just the best food to use for stamina DPS right now. So I'm going to go pick up a Mundus stone. We do have 2 options in terms of Mundus stone. You can go with the warrior like I have here, or you can go with the lover, and that's all going to depend on the number of debuff sets that you get in terms of penetration. So you obviously have Sunderflame and Nightmother's Gaze as your 2 penetration sets, and then you do have things like, as a Templar, you have Minor Fracture from Power of the Light, but you also need to consider Infused Torag's Crusher, or just a plain Infused Crusher, as well as Alkosh. So if you have all your debuffs up, then if you actually don't need any points into piercing, you actually end up over penetrating by about 200 or so penetration. However, if you don't have all those debuffs up, and then that's where you might want to consider using the lover. So remember that the penetration cap is 18,200. So with the lover, if you're still at or below the penetration cap, then it will win out over the warrior when it comes to DPS. However, if you are using the lover and it does put you over the penetration cap by a significant margin, anything more than 400 or 500 penetration, then the warrior is going to win out, because any additional penetration that you get over that penetration cap is a DPS loss. So now we're going to go ahead with talk about our abilities. For our front bar, we have Biting Jabs, Blood Craze. You can go with the other morph of Blood Craze, Rending Slashes. I like the Blood Craze for the additional heal over time, but Rending Slashes does do more DPS overall. Power of the Light, Deadly Cloak, and we have Repentance, which is gives us minor Fortitude, minor Endurance, and minor Intellect, which boosts our regen a little bit. Plus, after trash pulls, you can use this to get back your health as well as your stamina. And our ultimate's going to be Flawless Dawnbreaker. We're not going to be using this as our damage ultimate. This is just here for the weapon damage boost that we get. For our back bar, I have Blazing Spear, but you can use something like Resolving Vigor instead if you would like. Blazing Spear does add a little bit to DPS, but it does use Magicka, so you can't obviously use it all the time, but it is nice to have. Plus, you do have that additional shard for resource gain for your allies, so that's always nice to have as well. But you don't have to use Blazing Spear in your rotation if you don't want to. I personally don't. I just have this here in case I do need to give out synergies for sustain. Poison Injection, Handless Hail, Razor Caltrops, Rearming Trap. Your bread and butter stamina DPS back bar. And your ultimate is going to be Crescent Sweeps. So this is why we want War Machine if you are going to be using Crescent Sweep on your jewelry and armor, just so because we are using Crescent Sweep on our back bar here. So if you can replace this with Ballista if you'd like under the bow line here. I have to actually get it. So you can replace this with Ballista here, and that's when you're going to want to use Blazing Spear here instead of Resolving Vigor. Because of the Aedric Spear passive, Piercing Sphere, you need to have an Aedric Spear ability slotted in order to get that additional 10% critical damage. So if you do want to use Ballista as your primary ultimate, for example, if you're using Vicious Ophidian instead of War Machine, then you will have to use Blazing Spear here if you want to maintain that passive. You can't really use Vigor here for that passive. I'm going to replace this with Crescent Sweeps now. Now we're going to talk about our CPs. You have 240 CPs to spread across each of the 3 different constellation types. Starting off with our green CPs, we have 75 into Mooncalf, 75 into Tenacity. That leaves 90 points, which you can put across the rest of the nodes however you'd like. It kind of depends on what passives you want as well as your playstyle. I have 31 to Shadow Ward, 31 into Tumbling, and 28 into Warlord. But again, you can kind of play around with those however you'd like. For our blue CPs, I do want to start off with a disclaimer here. This is optimized for my raid group, so we get Night Mother's Gaze, Sunderflame, Minor Fracture from a Templar, as well as Infused Crusher. So I don't have Alkosh, so that's why I have 24 points into Piercing. In order to figure out the optimal CP point distribution for you, you're going to need 2 add-ons. You're going to need Constellations right here, and you're going to need Combat Metrics to work with Constellations. So what you're going to do is basically you're going to do a parse, preferably an in-raid parse. So something like Velarial or Stone Atronach or even the Mage are pretty good options to choose for in-raid parses because those are pretty much tank and spank bosses. Basically, you're going to want to save that report, come over to Constellations, hit Combat Metrics Import when you have that Combat Metrics report uploaded, and import all the relevant stats you need. You will need to manually input your weapon penetration, however. Swap over to the Champion Points tab here. You hit Calculate, and then under this column here, it'll tell you the optimal CP point distribution for your specific parse. So you can kind of play around with this a little bit. I like to do basically do several parses and kind of figure out which one is the most common. Or alternatively, you can just figure out how many points you need to put into Piercing and then work around like so. So I have 64 into Mighty, 24 into Piercing, 56 into Precise Strikes, 52 into Thaumaturge, and 44 into Master at Arms. Now finally for our red CPs, I like to take a one-size-fits-most approach. So I go for a balanced approach so I don't have to redistribute for the content that I'm running. However, you can redistribute accordingly depending on the content you're running. For example, in Vet Maw, you're taking a lot more magical damage than you are physical damage, so you might want to take points out of Hardy and put them into Elemental Defender and Spell Shield instead. So that's all going to be dependent on how survivable you think you are and whether or not you want to shift your points around. I have 56 into Ironclad, 56 into Thickskin, 64 into Hardy, and 64 into Elemental Defender. Now you can also put 10 points into Quick Recovery here in order to get the Field Physician passive. This basically reduces the damage you take while you're resurrecting one of your allies, which is a very nice passive to have. You can also go up to 30 points if you'd like for the Infusion passive. However, the Infusion passive is not very strong on stamina DPS, so I don't recommend going that route. I would only stick with 10 points at the Field Physician for the Field Physician passive. So now that all that is said and done, let's go ahead and talk about our rotation. Let's go ahead and head over to our 3 million dummy here. So all of your back bar dots can be very important to keep up. So that's Endless Hail, Poison Injection, Razor Caltrops, and Rearming Trap. So those are all very important to keep up. And on your front bar, you obviously want to prioritize Power of the Light for that Minor Fracture, Minor Breach debuff, as well as Deadly Cloak for that additional damage mitigation. So obviously before you go into a parse, you want to buff up with your potions and things like that. I like to start a parse off with, or any fight really, with Rearming Trap first. So Rearming Trap, and then you're going to go ahead and use Endless Hail, Poison Injection, raise a Caltrops. You would use your ultimate here, light attack into Power of the Light. And then we do... So we do 3 heavy attacks on our front bar here. So we do a light attack into Power of the Light, heavy attack, Rending Slashes, heavy attack, jabs, heavy attack of the Cloak, light attack, Power of the Light. And that's basically our entire rotation. It's a very static rotation. You will see a little bit of a downtime on your dots because we are prioritizing maintaining Power of the Light instead. You can see here Endless Hail ran out there, Caltrops ended there. So we do end up losing a little bit of uptime on our backbar dots, and that's perfectly fine because we do want to prioritize getting Power of the Light up as much as we can to help out our group DPS. So it's okay to let your backbar dots drop off a little bit here. They're only going to be down for between 1 and 2 seconds, so it's not that big of a DPS loss, but that is one of the sources of a DPS loss. Now for your ultimate, because your ultimate's always going to be on your bow bar, you're going to want to use it after you lay down all your dots on your back bar. So you're going to want to do Endless Hail, Poison Injection, raise a Caltrops, Rearming Trap, and then use Crescent Sweeps or Ballista. This is for, if you're using Crescent Sweeps and with War Machine, then that just makes sure your dots are running while you have Major Slayer up, so you're not wasting any of that Major Slayer uptime. And obviously if you have Ballista, you want to maintain that Hawkeye passive for the boost in damage, so that's why you want to do it last in your rotation rather than first. Now if you do want to use Blazing Spear in your rotation, you'll use that after you use Rearming Trap, so it would look like this. For your back bar rotation, this, and then you swap cancel out of Blazing Spear. If you do use Blazing Spear, then you will definitely have downtime on your back bar dots, so that's something you want to keep in mind if you are going to use Blazing Spear. So I'll do a rotation once it's revived. So for example here, we're using Blazing Spear in our rotation. Light attack, heavy attack, heavy attack, heavy attack, and light attacking. So you can see here by the time we start doing our backbar dots again, all of our backbar dots have expired. And that's just the price you pay for prioritizing Power of the Light uptime. You can go with 2 light attacks if you do want to incorporate Spear, but it is a loss in sustain. You do a light attack here, 2 heavy attacks, then light attack, Deadly Cloak, light attack, Power of the Light. If you want to use Blazing Spear, that is one rotation that you can use to kind of minimize backbar dot downtime. But again, that's something that you can decide for yourself whether or not you want to do that or not. So once we get out of combat with that dummy and we get our stamina all the way back up, we will go ahead and get started. We ran out of food. We'll go ahead and get started with the 6 billion W parse so you guys can get an idea of what the rotation looks like and what kind of DPS you can expect to pull here. Okay, so we're out of combat. I'm going to reset this dummy so it's at full health. We do have a little bit of a lag spike issue here on the PTS right now, so do bear that in mind when we do our rotation. If you see me do some weird things, then that's probably because of lag. Another thing I want to make note of here is that Stamplars don't have a native source of major fracture, so you don't necessarily want to compare a parse with a Stamplar to something like a Stam Decay or Stamina Nightblade, where they do have sources of major fracture. You will be pulling less DPS than them on a dummy parse because you don't have an innate source of major fracture. So that's something you want to keep in mind when we take a look at our parse here. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So I will be doing a Blazing Spear rotation just so you guys can see what it looks like, as well as the level of sustain. So I will be doing 2 light attacks and 2 heavy attacks on the front bar. If I do run out of stamina towards the end though, I will swap to a 3 heavy attack rotation instead. Oops. So I'm doing 3 heavy attacks now for a little bit, just so I can maintain my stamina. God damn it, I used Deadly Cloak instead of jabs again. I'm doing 3 heavy attacks here. Oh, I missed the ultimate. That's alright. So we'll keep on doing 3 heavy attacks for now. So you can see here that the rotation here with 2 and 2 is pretty hard to maintain. So I've swapped entirely over to a 3 heavy attack rotation here. Obviously in a group this is going to be a little bit better in terms of sustain because you will get resources from your healers. So we did kind of have a screw rotation at the end there because I did end up running out of stamina. But that's what a Blazing Spear rotation would look like. Obviously if you're not going to be using Blazing Spear, then you just ignore that and you just go to your front bar and do that 3 heavy attack rotation that I showed you earlier. So do keep in mind when we take a look at our parse here that we don't have a source of major fracture, so we are missing out on about 8% DPS. So we would pull 8% higher if we did have a source of major fracture. So do keep that in mind when we take a look at our parse. It would help if I actually have it bound to the right key. There we go. So we don't want this one. So here's our parse here, 32.9k, almost 33k, without major fractures. That's pretty nice. It's not a terrible parse to have. So we can see here that, where is it? Blazing Spear doesn't do that much DPS, but where it comes into play here is with where is it? Burning Light. So that's the spear basically helps to proc Burning Light, which is a passive under the Aegis Spear line. So if you are using Blazing Spear, then you will get more DPS from Burning Light compared to not. But like I said earlier, and as you guys notice, the sustain does get worse because you are dropping off. And you have to do 2 heavy attacks with 2 light attacks instead of 3 heavy attacks in your rotation, so you won't necessarily be able to sustain very well. Plus you're letting your dots drop off on your back bar, so that reduces DPS there. So you don't necessarily need to use Blazing Spear. You can use it occasionally if you'd like, but that's kind of up to you how you want to play with that. So you can see Endless Hail Razor, Caltrops, Poison Injection are all very strong dots, making up our 1, 2, and 4. And Power of the Light is over here. It's pretty strong, so that's why you kind of want to prioritize Power of the Light as well, because it does do a considerable amount of DPS on top of the minor fracture and minor breach that it provides. So that's it for this build video. Hope you guys found it informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.